Colonel William Yarborough adjusts his green beret and spreads a map of Colombia across a polished oak table. We are in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, on March 15th of 1962, in Conference Room B7. Around him, 23 Colombian military officers lean forward in their chairs, notebooks open, pens poised. These are not ordinary students. They're colonels and majors who fought guerrillas in the mountains of Tolima and Huila. Men who've seen their soldiers blown apart by ELN bombs and FARC ambushes. But today, they're learning a new kind of warfare. Gentlemen, Yarborough begins, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spent 2 decades perfecting the art of killing communists. Traditional military doctrine will not work in Colombia. You cannot defeat an insurgency by fighting it like a conventional army. You must become the insurgency, but better, more ruthless, and absolutely without mercy. The Colombian officer scribbled notes as Yarborough outlines what U.S. Special Forces call unconventional warfare. Create paramilitary forces that operate outside of legal constraints. Target civilian populations suspected of supporting guerrillas. Use terror as a weapon of psychological warfare. Establish intelligence networks that penetrate every village, every family, every conversation. The enemy, Yarborough continues, pointing to photographs of FARC leaders pinned to a bulletin board, uses the people as the ocean in which they can swim. Your job is to drain that ocean. Make the cost of supporting guerrillas so high that no rational person would consider it. One Colombian colonel raises his hand. What about international law? The Geneva Convention? Yarborough's smile is cold as winter steel. Communists don't follow international laws, Colonel. They rape nuns and murder children. If you want to defeat them, you have to be willing to do whatever it takes. The question isn't whether you'll get your hands dirty, it's whether you'll get them dirty enough to win. This training session, one of dozens conducted throughout the 1960s, will transform the nature of warfare in Colombia. The tactics learned in this sterile conference room will be practiced in peasant villages across the Andes. American counterinsurgency doctrine will merge with Colombian traditions of political violence to create something unprecedented, a systematic campaign of state terror that makes la violencia look spontaneous. This is part 3 of the Colombian conflict, Dirty War. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. Welcome back. Before we get into it, a quick favor. If you are enjoying the show and you like what you've been hearing, then please give us a follow. Also, make sure you rate and review the show wherever you listen, because that helps others find the show. Okay, on with the story. Last time we witnessed how La Violencia gave birth to the guerrilla movements that would define Colombia for the next half-century. We saw peasant farmers like Pedro Antonio Marin transform into revolutionary commanders, and others like priest Camilo Torres who chose the gun over the gospel. We entered a world where political differences justified unlimited violence, where compromise became betrayal, where entire regions descended into systematic brutality. Today, we explore how the Colombian government, backed by American money, training, and Cold War ideology, responded to this guerrilla threat. This isn't just a story of military operations and body counts. This is the story of how a democracy chose to fight monsters by becoming one itself. How American anti-communist doctrine merged with Colombian traditions of exclusion to create paramilitary forces that would prove more destructive than the guerrillas that they were meant to defeat. We are entering the heart of what scholars call the Dirty War, a systematic campaign where the lines between state and criminal, between soldier and assassin, between protecting democracy and destroying it, disappeared entirely. By 1964, the limitations of conventional counterinsurgency were becoming painfully apparent to Colombian military strategists. Operation Mar Italia, launched with 16,000 soldiers against fewer than 50 peasant fighters, had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of crushing Manuel Marulanda's peasant republic, it had transformed scattered rural self-defense groups into the nuclei of what would become the FARC. The problem wasn't tactical. Colombian forces had superior numbers, better equipment, and American advisors schooled in the latest counterinsurgency doctrines. The problem was strategic. Every military victory created new enemies. Every village bombed in search of guerrillas produced new guerrilla recruits. Every family displaced by military operations became a potential support network for revolutionary forces. Picture the psychological impact on Colombian officers who joined the military believing they were defending democracy against communist tyranny. Instead, they found themselves bombing schoolhouses, arresting teachers, and treating their own citizens as enemy combatants. Some adapted by embracing the logic of total war. If defeating communism required extreme measures, then extreme measures were justified. Others compartmentalized their actions, separating personal morality from professional duty. Both adaptations led to the same place: the normalization of violence against civilians as a legitimate instrument of state policy. Plan Lasso, LASO, the Latin American security operation, represented America's comprehensive strategy for containing communism in Colombia. Launched in 1962, it combined military force with civic action programs, reflecting the dual approach that had shown promise in other Cold War conflicts. On paper, the plan seemed sound. Use overwhelming force to crush guerrilla strongholds while winning hearts and minds through development projects. But implementation revealed fundamental misunderstandings about Colombian conflicts. American trainers, fresh from experiences in Vietnam and Guatemala, assumed they were fighting foreign-backed communist insurgents who could be separated from local populations through superior firepower and political reform. What they actually confronted was something far more complex. A civil war rooted in century-old grievances, where guerrillas weren't foreign invaders, but neighbors whose radicalization grew directly from state violence. The emergence of paramilitary forces represented the logical evolution of this thinking. If conventional military operations couldn't distinguish between guerrillas and their supporters, then unconventional forces operating outside legal constraints could solve the problem more efficiently. Consider Carlos Castaño Gil in 1981. A 19-year-old rancher's son whose father has just been murdered by FARC guerrillas after paying their ransom demand. Young Carlos faces a choice that thousands of Colombians confronted during this period: accept the state's inability to protect law-abiding citizens, or take protection into your own hands. Castaño chose resistance, but his resistance quickly evolves from self-defense to offense, from protecting his family's property to cleansing entire regions of suspected guerrilla sympathizers. The logic is seductive in its simplicity. If you can't reform the system, replace it. If the government won't eliminate terrorists, patriotic citizens must do the job themselves. Listen to me, he tells his assembled men. Ranch hands, off-duty policemen, military deserters, and killers recruited from Medellin slums. The FARC thinks they can murder our families and steal our land because the government is too weak to stop them. They are wrong. We are going to show them what real terror looks like. The intellectual framework for this escalation came directly from American counterinsurgency doctrine. Field Manual 3116 didn't explicitly advocate terrorism, but its emphasis on population control, intelligence networks, and psychological warfare provided theoretical justification for increasingly extreme measures. When Colombian officers trained at the School of the Americas returned home, they brought with them not just tactical knowledge, but conceptual frameworks that redefine civilian populations as legitimate military targets. The most insidious aspect of this transformation was how it presented itself as democratic rather than authoritarian. Paramilitary forces weren't overthrowing democracy. They were saving it from communist subversion. They weren't violating human rights. They were protecting the human rights of law-abiding citizens from terrorist violation. This rhetorical inversion allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary violence while maintaining their self-image as moral actors. Ranch hands who macheted peasants to death believed they were defending civilization. Military officers who coordinated massacres believed that they were preserving democratic institutions from revolutionary destruction. Meanwhile, in Bogotá's U.S. Embassy, Ambassador Kobe Oliver reviews intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. Despite 3 years of intensive counterinsurgency operations, FARC had grown from 48 survivors to over 1,000 active fighters. The ELN controlled territory in 6 departments. Every military victory seemed to create new recruitment opportunities for the revolutionaries. The problem, Oliver told his assembled staff, isn't that we're not killing enough guerrillas. The problem is that we're creating more guerrillas faster than we can kill them. CIA Station Chief Robert Adams opened a classified folder marked Eyes Only. We need to fundamentally rethink our approach. We expand the program, create more paramilitary forces, better intelligence networks, more aggressive targeting of civilian support structures. If we can't distinguish between guerrillas and their supporters, we stop trying to distinguish. The document Adams brought was U.S. Army Field Manual 3116, Counter-Guerrilla Operations. Developed from lessons learned in Vietnam, it advocated tactics that blur the line between counterinsurgency and terrorism. Target civilians who support guerrillas. Create paramilitary forces that operate outside of legal constraints. Use terror as a weapon of psychological warfare. Congress will never approve this level of involvement, Oliver worried. Congress doesn't need to know the details, Adams replied. We're not talking about American troops. We're talking about training Colombian forces to do what's necessary. Plausible deniability. Within months, Colombian military units trained in population control techniques would begin implementing strategies designed not just to defeat guerrillas, but to terrorize entire communities into submission. The methodology of paramilitary terror reached its horrific peak in operations designed not just to eliminate suspected guerrilla supporters, but to terrorize entire communities into submission. The paramilitaries who developed these techniques weren't sadistic monsters. They were rational actors implementing systematic applications of counterinsurgency theory. Different methods of murder sent different messages. Public executions demonstrated paramilitary power. Forced disappearances created uncertainty and paranoia. Sexual violence destroyed family structures and community trust. Mass graves eliminated physical evidence while preserving psychological impact. Most importantly, Paramilitaries perfected the art of selected violence, killing enough people to terrorize everyone while preserving enough people to maintain economic productivity. They weren't trying to depopulate territories. They were trying to control populations through calculated applications of terror. The corporate dimension of Colombia's conflict reveals how economic interests intersected with political violence to create self-sustaining cycles of terror. When companies like Chiquita Brands International began paying security taxes to paramilitary forces, they weren't just buying protection from guerrilla attacks. They were financing political cleansing operations that eliminated labor organizers, environmental activists, and land right advocates. Picture Robert Kissinger, Chiquita's security chief for Colombia, reviewing quarterly reports in 1990. The numbers tell a story that won't appear in any corporate annual report. Protection payments to paramilitary forces have increased 300% over the past 5 years, but production disruption from guerrilla attacks have dropped to near zero. The arrangement is working, as plantation manager reports. AUC units provide security for our plantations, our workers, our transportation routes. The FARC doesn't operate in areas where we have agreements. The business logic was impeccable. Guerrilla threats to corporate operations were real. Paramilitary protection was effective. The human rights consequences were someone else's problem. Corporations could claim that they were victims of extortion rather than sponsors of terrorism. This arrangement created perverse incentives throughout Colombian society. Violence became profitable for everyone involved. Guerrillas profited from kidnapping and extortion. Paramilitaries profited from protection rackets. Corporations profited from cheap labor and resource extraction. Government officials profited from bribes and kickbacks from all sides. The only people who didn't profit were civilians, caught between these competing criminal enterprises. The human cost of these strategies became undeniably clear in places like El Salado, a small coffee-growing village where 60-year-old Maria Eugenia Contreras rocked her grandson to sleep on the night of February 16, 2000. Through her window, she could see lights moving through the village, not the warm yellow of oil lamps, but the harsh white of military flashlights. These were not government soldiers. These were paramilitaries from the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, the AUC. They'd come to El Salado because someone told them that the village supported guerrillas. And maybe it's true. Some families here do help the FARC, but most people just want to be left alone and grow coffee and raise their children. That distinction did not matter tonight. The paramilitaries move from house to house with the efficiency of men who've done this before. They're implementing what their American-trained commanders call draining the ocean. As they execute villagers in the town square, they play music. Vallenato songs, mixed with recorded messages about the prize of supporting terrorism. This is what happens, the recorded voice announces over loudspeakers, when communities choose terrorists over patriots. The massacre continues for 3 days. When it ends, 63 people are dead, and El Salado has been erased as a functioning community. But El Salado isn't unique. It's one of hundreds of paramilitary massacres conducted using tactics developed in American training programs. Maria survives because she hides in a coffee storage shed for 4 days, listening to her village being destroyed. When she finally emerges, she finds El Salado transformed into a monument to terror. Empty houses, blood-stained walls, silence where laughter used to be. The systemic breakdown of Colombian institutions reached a symbolic climax during the Palace of Justice siege in November of 1985. When M-19 guerrillas stormed Colombia's Supreme Court and the military retook it by force, destroying much of the building and killing most of the hostages in the process. The message was unmistakable. Colombian institutions existed only when armed groups permitted them to exist. Picture Supreme Court Justice Carlos Medellin Forero crawling beneath his overturned desk as gunfire echoes through the corridors. This isn't just about guerrilla demands. This is about testing whether Colombian democracy can survive when all sides choose violence over law. The siege becomes a microcosm of Colombia's broader conflict. Revolutionaries use terror to advance political goals. Security forces destroy institutions to save them. Civilians are caught between competing forms of extremism. When it ends with over 100 dead, including 11 Supreme Court justices, democracy itself has become performance theater conducted under the threat of assassination. From that point forward, courts rule on cases when paramilitaries allow them to rule. Elections happen when guerrillas decide not to disrupt them. Congress passes laws when armed groups permit them to pass. Understanding this transformation requires grappling with an uncomfortable truth. The violence wasn't irrational or senseless. From each actor's perspective, escalation was logical response to escalation. Guerrillas escalated attacks to prove government weakness. Paramilitaries escalated massacres to prove guerrilla weakness. Government forces escalated repression to prove state strength. The result was a country where violence became not the breakdown of politics, but politics by other means, where the question wasn't who was right or wrong, but who was strong enough to impose their definition of order. By the early 1980s, this system had achieved something unprecedented, a stable equilibrium of mutual destruction. A three-way war between government forces, guerrilla armies, and paramilitary death squads had created balance. Not peace, but balance of terror that fed on the very problem it claimed to solve. As always, the human cost was staggering. Since La Violencia began in 1948, over 220,000 people had died in political violence. 5 million had been internally displaced. Entire regions had been depopulated by massacres, kidnappings, and forced recruitment. But the most profound damage wasn't statistical. It was psychological. Colombia had created a culture where violence was normalized to the very extreme. Compromise was always weakness, and the only security came from belonging to an armed group. Children grew up learning that law existed only when backed by force, that justice came from guns rather than courts, and that survival required choosing sides in conflicts they didn't start and couldn't understand. This transformation explains why Colombia's conflict continued to prove so resistant. All sides had adapted to permanent war. Guerrilla commanders who had spent decades in the jungle couldn't imagine life in civilian society. Paramilitary leaders who had built empires through violence couldn't conceive of politics without weapons. Government officials who had managed conflict rather than resolved it couldn't envision institutions based on law rather than force. But most tragically, ordinary Colombians had learned to survive by accepting the unacceptable, to build lives and raise families amid apocalyptic violence, to find meaning and hope in circumstances that should have destroyed both. But Colombia's story doesn't end with this catalog of horrors. Even as the country descended into systematic terror, new forces were gathering in the mountains and cities that would fundamentally alter the conflict's dynamics. In the coca-growing regions of the Andes, a different kind of entrepreneur was emerging. Men who understood that Colombia's geographic position and weak institutions made it the perfect laboratory for a new form of organized crime. The extreme brutality of the Dirty War period had created something unexpected, a vacuum of moral authority that criminal organizations could fill more effectively than political movements. When the state abandoned entire regions to paramilitary terror, when guerrillas imposed revolutionary justice through violence, when corporations funded private armies, ordinary Colombians began looking for alternative sources of order and protection. Some of those alternatives would prove even more dangerous than the forces that they replaced. By the late 1970s, small-time smugglers in Medellin and Cali had discovered that Americans' insatiable appetite for cocaine could generate profits that dwarf anything imaginable through traditional crime. More importantly, they realized that Colombia's ongoing conflict provided perfect cover for building criminal empires. In a country where violence was normalized, where institutions were captured by armed groups, where law existed only when backed by force, drug traffickers could operate with unprecedented freedom. The man who would come to symbolize this transformation was already building his empire in the slums of Medellin, a charismatic sociopath named Pablo Escobar, who understood that in Colombia, sufficient wealth could purchase sufficient firepower to challenge any authority. His rise would complete the triangle of violence that consumed Colombia for the next 2 decades. Guerrillas, paramilitaries, and narco cartels, each feeding off of the chaos created by the other. Next time on Double Helix, picture a young Pablo Escobar in 1975 standing in a Medellin cemetery where he's just stolen tombstones to resell, dreaming of wealth and power beyond imagination. You'll witness how a petty criminal from the barrios transforms into the world's most powerful drug trafficker, building an empire that challenges the Colombian state itself. This is the story of how cocaine money completed Colombia's transformation from struggling democracy to narco-state. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.